And then before we begin, kind of set the tone for what you want to achieve with this evening. If you already have some ideas of what you'd like to accomplish by being here, that's great. You can bring those to mind. But otherwise, just to entertain this idea that you're here to explore the concept of using our external life, our working world, as a means to explore deeper purpose, deeper connection, to bring what is spiritual into the workplace. And to do this for our own benefit, because we will certainly be more at peace, in harmony, but moreover, we will also be harmonious with others, be a support for them in their own strides to accomplish the same. And just hold that intention for being here. And then when you're ready, you can end the meditation and open your eyes. So any comments on that short reflection? Anything that was noticeable to any of you, or maybe even surprising to some of you, in terms of what you saw when you explored that idea of your work life and your inner life? Convergence, divergence? Anyone want to share anything? Yes, Peter. Uh-huh. Okay. 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 Good, good. That is frequently the case. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Yes, Christine. Saw the other side of it. Yeah, yeah. Another way to see it. Yeah. Right. Wow. It's a big light bulb to go off. Yeah. Good. Wonderful. We'll be exploring these ideas, definitely. These are great. Thanks for sharing that, Christine. Anyone else? Yes, Steve.
I thought of a line from To Kill a Mockingbird in which Jim, Atticus' son, was complaining about his father, and his neighbor said, "Your father's the same man inside the home as he is outside."
Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is the ideal, to have that kind of everything be congruent, convergent. Actually, some of the inspiration for doing this talk came from an article I read on the internet by Steve Pavlina. Some of you may have heard of him. He has some Buddhist leanings, but he also has maybe a different way. He's approaching a lot of issues in the workplace and trying to provide support to people. And he wrote an article called Living Congruently. And the whole concept behind the article was that we do tend to compartmentalize our lives, right? We've got our spiritual life, and we've got our work life, and we have our home life, and we have, our even what we do in regards to our health and what have you. All of these being like balls in a sense that we're juggling, and none of them necessarily matching up with the others, almost being in competition with the others. I'm going to share a little bit of what he says in that article that I found quite inspiring. He says, "Are we supposed to live like a collection of parts or as an integrated whole? I wondered whether it would be possible to live in such a way where there was only one set of rules governing all areas, essentially meaning that I followed my deepest spiritual beliefs in all matters. This line of questioning led me to discover just how it might be possible for all these different parts of my life to become a single integrated whole. This would mean that my business and my conscience and my interpersonal relationships were all one. There would be no sense of separation." So I think this is ideally what we want to be living, as kind of our whole selves at all time, not feeling like a portion of me is here and a portion is there, and we have to try to make all those things uh, kind of work together, but rather just to be ourselves in our most genuine way all the time. And I had the good fortune of running across a book that we're going to be relying upon to some degree, what is presented there, called Work as a Spiritual Practice, by Louis Richmond, who's also written a recent book about conscious aging, using aging as the path, as we're all constantly aging, and some of us aging more than others are aging. or being a little more aged than others are. But so anyway, I really liked his approach, and that's a bit of what we're going to share. And we'll look at this diagram that's on the board shortly that comes from that. But I guess it might be good to start off with saying, but when we say using work as a spiritual practice, certainly we could say even using relationships as a spiritual practice, using anything where we have another dimension of our lives. What do we mean by a spiritual practice? I think this is something that if you asked anyone on the street what their definition for spirituality is, you probably might get a lot of different definitions because each person might have a particular background that they're coming from in terms of how they define spirituality. I'm going to give you a Buddhist sort of description of what we mean by spirituality, just as a starting point. But again, you can certainly take wherever your own view is of what it means to be spiritual and apply it to what we're looking at tonight. I would say that in essence, Buddhism, when we talk about a spiritual path, we're talking about doing two main things. The whole arena of Buddhist thought and Buddhist work that we do is to look at our minds. And so essentially we're talking about doing two things: reducing the negative tendencies, which I think we are all quite familiar with. You know, the crazy, angry, jealous, prideful minds, the things that get in the way of our own peace of mind as well as our relationships with others. And then to increase and make more prominent those that are positive, those that actually create more harmony with others and make us feel better ourselves. Things like compassion and love, patience, generosity, you know, all of these sorts of qualities. So essentially the Buddhist path, if we talk about spirituality, what it means is to do those two things: reducing what is negative, increasing what is positive. Again, we do this because we'll be better off in the end, but then also we will have an effect on those around us. So again, I think that's relatively easy to translate in some regard to whatever you consider to be a spiritual path. But as we go through tonight, you can certainly, as I said, use whatever your own description or definition of spiritual practice or spiritual path is, and kind of fill it in from there. And I think it'll still translate quite well to what we're looking at. Before we get into the energy wheel that's up here on the chart, which is how Louis Richmond approaches this whole topic, which he actually says comes from Buddhism, but I never saw it in any other Buddhist teachings per se. I wasn't taught the energy wheel at the master's program over in Italy, right, Emily? I don't think we ever got into the energy wheel. Might have been useful, um, but I might talk just a little bit about Buddhist ideas of livelihood in general. There's a wonderful book on the Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path is one of the ways that the Buddhist path is talked about in terms of various things that we focus on. And one of those eight is actually having right or correct livelihood. I just want to give a little bit of a context for that because it's useful to be able to look at the way that we might approach what is good livelihood. What does it mean to have correct livelihood? Because some of you may find yourselves doing this sort of work that we're going to look at with regard to the energy wheel, but finding that you're getting stuck because the workplace that you're in, the livelihood that you have, isn't conducive to that type of work. And so in essence, we say that there's a threefold investigation. This comes from a book called Eight Mindful Steps to Happiness, which some of you may have seen before. I'm always trying to remember the full name of the author. He's a Sri Lankan monk. Bhante Hennapola Gunaratana, I think, something like that. Anyway, I'm probably mispronouncing it horribly. But anyway, he says that there's a threefold investigation that we might do in terms of our current livelihood or what we might like to do to see whether this is really conducive to practicing a spiritual path, especially in this dimension of trying to work with our minds in that way, to reduce what is negative, to increase the positive qualities. And he says the very first one is to say, by nature, is what you're involved in kind of wholesome? So if you were working for a weapons company, for example, or a place where they did animal testing and put animals through a lot of, what we would see as torture to some degree, but animal testing and what have you. If you worked for a company where you're engaged in that type of behavior, it might be very hard for you to bring spiritual principles of this type into the workplace because the purpose of the work that you're doing is a bit misguided in that way. Again, I'm not trying to put a value judgment on it, if those of you in the room that might have that type of work, but it's something maybe to explore. is there that component that makes our mind somewhat disturbed by virtue of the work that we're engaged in, what we are contributing to in the world? I spent about 20 years of my corporate life before I got involved in Buddhism more seriously and became a teacher in Buddhism, uh, working just up the way in San Francisco for Levi Strauss. And I worked there in their accounting and finance area. And there were certainly some times where I still had some small questions about what we as a company were doing. But in general, I found that it was work that was relatively conducive to maintaining some peace of mind. There was an underlying company ethic that was being followed pretty closely. So these are the sorts of things you might begin looking at. Is the work that you're doing by nature something that's going to disturb the mind? Because it's not so wholesome in terms of some of the qualities of it. Certainly, if you have to lie frequently in your occupation, this will be something that, again, is very difficult for the mind then to increase the sort of positive qualities around honesty and integrity that we really are ideally looking for. The second investigation, in terms of what question we would ask in a Buddhist context, this is called, does this job cause me myself to break the five moral precepts? The five moral precepts in Buddhism, I don't need to go into a full description of them, but the ones that would be involved in the workplace mostly would be around stealing or lying. Possibly even also the fifth one is more around intoxicants and that sort of thing. Frequently in the workplace, we do end up having those situations where we have to, have drinks with clients and what have you. But if there's an abuse of that, certainly that could be a factor. But this is because as Buddhists, we kind of want to live by these five moral precepts. This is how we actually, here at Land of Medicine Buddha, conduct all the programs, is people kind of agreeing they'll be here and abide by those precepts when they're here. But stealing and lying are obviously the two that if we ourselves have to engage in frequently, that we're probably going to have a hard time, again, getting the mind to focus and develop these qualities that we want to bring into the workplace. The last one's an interesting one that he mentions in this book. He says, are there other aspects of my job that disturb me and keep my mind from settling down? In other words, what is the effect of my work on my mind? So while you might have the first one covered, I have a good occupation, I'm doing something wholesome, has no problem, there's no problem there, and you might also have the second one. You don't have to engage in anything that's kind of naturally not so virtuous. But the third one might be the issue, is that you find that the work that you have to do and the way that you go about it and how the office works and whatever, all of that kind of dynamic could actually be a detriment to practicing a real spiritual path. And there may be situations where we have to say, thank you very much, I'm going to find another job, see you later, because our minds won't really be able to do this type of work. Now, again, we can always work with anything at some level. I mean, Buddhism doesn't teach that we have to have perfect external situations in order to practice. In fact, we frequently talk about practicing with even the most difficult circumstances. But nonetheless, for most of us, I think it's really quite useful to have an environment that isn't continually putting us on edge or making us very stressed out or what have you. Are any comments or reflections on that idea and on what we'll be going into something that's a little more relevant to all of us, but I just thought I'd cover that. Any comments? Okay. So let's begin looking at this whole idea of having kind of that as a backdrop, that what we want to be doing is taking our inner self, which is this idea of where we want to be in terms of our values, our way of producing a more wholesome, harmonious being, and then also diminishing the negative tendencies. How do we bring that into the workplace? And this concept of the energy wheel kind of fits into this idea. Lewis Richman, in his introduction to this, he says, I want you to feel that whether you love your job or hate it, you can be awake and aware in your work. I want to redefine the term job satisfaction to mean not a job where everything goes well, but a job where we can grow, develop, and mature as human beings, regardless of what happens. This is the concept behind why we use this energy wheel as a way of acknowledging that this is ideally what we want to have happening in the workplace, is that when we are at work, we want to see it as a continuation of our spiritual work. So it's not the division between when we're on the cushion in the morning and when we get to work and suddenly we're a whole new person having to deal with another ball that we're juggling, rather than continuing to be the same person, just tackling different situations. So the energy wheel is a model that is symbolic of kind of the constant change that we have. One of the main things that the Buddha taught, and this is something that's quite obvious to us if we take a look at it, is the idea of impermanence, of constant change. They say that this is actually one of our greatest sources of suffering in our lives, is because we don't want things to change. We like things to be somewhat static and try to keep them in a realm where it's all quite comfortable. When things start moving out of our comfort zone, then we have to change, and there's that resistance to change. So frequently we try to keep it all in this very narrow range of comfort, not recognizing that there's actually great opportunity to grow when we confront the constant changes that we're experiencing. So this is why the symbology of a wheel is used, is because it's constantly moving and rotating. In the center there, I put some arrows, but the arrows could go the other way. The arrows could even go across. We find that if we look at, as we're going to, these four sort of zones of the energy wheel, if we look at them, we'll see that we frequently are floating from one to the other. Sometimes we even get stuck in one for a bit, and then suddenly it shifts and changes, and we're in another one. So we're going to explore all of these and get an idea of kind of what they're all about. I'm not going to read maybe one more passage from Lewis Richmond's book, and then we'll just do some exploration of all of this together. This is at the beginning when he's just introducing this concept of the energy wheel. He says all of us experience the same kind of change and volatility in our own jobs. We might attend a morning staff meeting that leaves us irritable and anxious. Then, on picking up our phone messages, we unexpectedly hear some wonderful news, and our mood is transformed. Then we meet an old friend for lunch and are bored with her interminable chatter about boyfriends. Back at the office, our indispensable assistant has suddenly gone home sick. Cancel our evening plans. We're going to have to work late. Our earlier euphoria vanishes, and we are irritable again. So does that sound familiar to anybody? I mean, bits of that maybe. Maybe it doesn't all happen exactly that way, but I think again, no matter what our work is, we're going to have shifts like this, constantly changing. We go to the ups and the downs and the in-betweens and the all overs. So the energy wheel is a way of organizing these various states of mind. The axis of positive and negative, so you'll notice that you've got positive to the right and negative to the left. I don't know if everyone can see the chart where it is there, but can certainly come up afterwards and take a look after we finish here. Um, these divide the mind into states that are unpleasant versus those that are pleasant. So anything that is positive creates a more pleasant tone within our minds, how we're going about our lives, whereas what's on the negative side are those things that are unpleasant experiences in general. Again, not to say that there's set in that, because there's pitfalls to all quadrants of the wheel. But we'll look at those as we go through them. But certainly these are sort of the feeling tone that we have from that experience. Then when we look at the other axis, the axis of hot and cool describes the intensity of the energy. This is why it's again called the energy wheel, is because we find that the energy that we have around these various quadrants is either going to be hot, meaning it's quite vibrant and a bit more volatile even in some ways, whereas it's cool, which tends to be, more subdued, not quite as much energy, but yet has its purposes and also once more has its downfalls, its pitfalls. So for example, anger is qualitatively a negative state. You'll see anger under conflict here in that quadrant. So it's in the negative half, the left half of the wheel. Uh, it's unpleasant, difficult, painful, and quantitatively, anger is intense, highly focused, and energized, right? So even though anger is negative, we see that there's that quality to it. It's not something where it takes us down into a state of depression. Rather, it makes everything quite lively and potentially, workable at some level because of that energy, but also can be quite quickly move into some pretty dangerous areas. So again, this is the whole idea of this wheel and how it's working. So the wheel represents the full range of our mental and emotional experiences. It's a natural human tendency to want to spend as much time as possible in the cool, positive quadrant, right? To be successful, accomplished, worry-free, relaxed, peaceful. And he even says that Buddhist meditation frequently kind of emphasizes that in Buddhist practice, right? That we all want to be in this place of calm and relaxation. And, but this is obviously not where you can hang out forever. And in fact, if you tried to hang out there forever, you're probably going to miss so many other opportunities. The energy wheel is also about the opportunities that our day brings to us, that the various experiences bring. So he says, the diagram is a wheel rather than a straight line because we circulate around it and through it, moving from one state to another, sometimes happy, sometimes sad, sometimes hot, sometimes cool. So, any questions on this idea of the diagram and kind of how it works? We'll get into the individual quadrants in a moment. Everyone understands the concepts? Okay. It's pretty straightforward. Last thing I'll read here is on the next page. This is page 26 of his book. The wheel is a map of change and a guideline for continuous transformation. Every sector of the wheel can flow into any other sector. So, for example, the hot negative states, anger, worry, fear, and so on, they can transform themselves into hot positive ones, such as inspiration and creativity. The hot negative states can sometimes dissolve directly into cool positive ones. So from the conflict, anger, and so on, we can find that they suddenly would move into places of contentment or calm, such as when a person who made us angry apologizes, or a threat that causes fear vanishes. So we see that again, it's very malleable and changeable from some side. It's also going to change from its own side in terms of what we are encountering, because we don't have much control over that external world. That external world's going to keep moving, keep new things arising. Anger and worry, for example, can sometimes lose their energy and sink back into the cool negative arena of depression and defeat, which often happens when these emotions are not dealt with. And finally, any sector of the wheel can simply circle back on itself and persist for days, months, or years, hopefully not years. So this is the concept that we're going to be exploring. We're going to go through each of these sort of quadrants and talk a little bit about them and give a feeling for what does it mean to work with them? What does it mean to actually utilize the power of the energy wheel to make decisions at that point that are more in line with our spiritual practice, more in line with how we really want to be at every time, throughout our day. And let's start with the red quadrant of conflict, because this is one that no doubt each of us deal with in some way. And most of what we look at here, again, doesn't have to be just applied to the work world, our working life. We could even see this in relationships, right? Sometimes the people who we live with are sources of this. They move us from quadrant to quadrant pretty easily. Saying something or doing something, and then suddenly we've got anger there, and then they apologize, and suddenly we've got contentment and calm, and then we start taking that for granted, and then something else comes up. So again, we see that this is not something solely for the arena of our work life, but we're going to look at it primarily from that. So again, conflict is really this whenever we have something going on in our workplace or our lives that brings that heightened energy that we sometimes associate with stress, with worry, fear. It can morph into anger at times. In this book, Lewis Richmond says that they once did a survey of like the most stressful jobs. Does anyone know what the most stressful job? Can you imagine what the most stressful job would be? Maybe you think it's yours, but center director. Nah. Motherhood's a good one, but it wasn't at the top of the list. Dentist, assembly line worker. No, these New York City taxi cab driver. I mean, they said New York City, but I think it could be just about any taxi driver. I mean, you can see that there's probably a certain level of stress there if you've ever gone to New York and dealt with taxis and the way that you have to manage and manipulate your way through traffic and what have you, maneuver through traffic. It's pretty stressful. What was interesting is the one they said was the least stressful. Any guesses on that? You probably won't ever get it because I wouldn't even think of it as an occupation necessarily, but there are people who do this. A mandolin maker. Guys, I suppose that you could say any like instrument like that, a violin or what, where you've got your work is it's very meticulous, but it's very spacious too, because you're doing something that is just you sitting there quietly, there's not a lot of other interfering factors, and you're just doing something that takes time. You can't make a mandolin or a violin overnight, right? It takes time to deal with the wood and mold it all and what have you. So maybe you can find your own career somewhere between mandolin maker and taxi driver. But no doubt each of us, like I said, has some level of stress. You know, the point is when we deal with conflict is that we're really not helpless. There is something that we can do in regard to these sorts of situations. Certainly the energy itself can change, as was said earlier. Suddenly the person that was angry or causing anger to arise in us, angry at us perhaps, apologizes, and then the energy changes right away. There's an opening and it becomes much more spacious. But what do we do if there's anger there all the time? What if you have a coworker that you've upset at one point and you come to work every day and there's that tension, right? There's that stress. Yeah, Kara.
You can express care and compassion
Good, good.
directly.
Yeah,
I want to talk with you.
yeah.
I'm concerned about you.
And even if the person doesn't want to have that level of communication, there's really nothing stopping us from doing that from our own side, regardless. A lot of what we project out on the world does tend to come back to us. If we think that we go to a stressful work environment every day and that everyone is on pins and needles and we have all that friction there that we're just perpetuating by thinking about it every day, we can certainly keep that alive. We don't have to buy into that every day. We can bring a different level of kind of awareness to what we're doing, a different perspective. In Buddhism, of course, we deal with a lot of things around how to reframe situations where anger arises. As Kara was saying, when we have some level of compassion for the person, of course, we're understanding that that person is under the control of their negative states of mind. If they were at peace and calm and in tune with more positive, harmonious states of mind, they wouldn't be an irritant to us. They wouldn't be doing things that annoyed us. But rather, if we can see them through that lens of understanding that that's the situation, they're doing the best that they can, given the states of their minds. We can maybe have a little space for some compassion and concern for them. If we can, try to diffuse the situation to some degree by creating the space for some communication, not in the middle of the workroom floor, but maybe again in private where people can say exactly what's going on for them. And that may be even if we're not in a position of supervising that person. It might just be as a coworker or perhaps even a boss, to be able to utilize that time to actually explore what's going on. A lot of times, though, like I said, we are making up a story about that person. I think I shared this the other day in the weekend course, but there was an interesting story that Jack Kornfield tells about a man in the military who was going through a mindfulness course. Mindfulness is a big thing in the world, and mindfulness does play a role in this. We'll talk about that as we go through some of this. There's now mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is really a technique to try to reduce a lot of those feelings that come up on the basis of stories that we're telling ourselves about what's going on in the world around us that cause things to get more volatile. And the story is that this man was about 6 weeks into an 8-week mindfulness course, and he happened to be at the grocery store, and he was dealing with grocery store at 6 o'clock or whatever, right after work when everybody's there. The store's crazy, lines are huge, and he's got his whole cart full of stuff that he needs to buy. And he notices a few people ahead of him in the line is a woman who's only got one or two items, and she's holding a baby, and she's just got this one or two items. And he's like thinking to himself, why isn't this person in the express lane? What are they doing in my lane? Why are they backing me up here? Starts all these stories, right, about the person and putting them in that category as an irritant. And then he starts applying his mindfulness-based stress reduction, and he calms himself down. And eventually the woman gets up to the front where she's checking out, and the cashier there is a younger woman, and all of a sudden the older woman is handing the baby to the cashier, and the cashier is holding the baby up and enjoying the laughing of the baby and everything. And of course his mind starts getting triggered again. He's like, why is she doing this? Doesn't she know, see all of us here backed up, we're waiting to get to the front of the line, and she's showing the baby to the cashier, and da 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 da, and they're all doting over it. And he eventually calms himself down again. So then he finally gets up to the front, to the cashier himself, and he's checking out. And he tells the woman, he says, that was kind of a cute baby that woman had. And she goes, oh, you think so? That was my son. Ever since my husband died, I've had to work 2 jobs, and I don't get to see my son so often. And so my mother brings him in, so I get a chance to see him. a totally different story than what he was telling himself, right? So if we really look at it, I think we do this frequently. We tend to think the worst of people. We tend to think that they're just being idiots or, crazy people or whatever, and are always sort of out to get us. And the reality is there's a whole other thing potentially going on. We don't know for sure what's going on in most cases, and we don't stop to ask. We don't really take the time to explore what's exactly happening. So a lot of conflict and the anger that can arise from it can come from these stories we tell ourselves. I remember I had a boss at Levi Strauss. Maybe she's listening. I don't know. I loved working for her, but she would have moods some days where I would take it personally, like, oh my God, she's really mad at me. What did I do? I mean, it become like this whole thing. And I mean, how egocentric, right? To think it was all about me. And frequently it was nothing to do with me. It had to do with something with her relationship to her boss or with something else that was going on. But maybe examine this and see to what extent are we telling ourselves these stories and then buying into them and thinking that they're gospel truth. And we start acting in accord with that, getting angry at people or upset by what people do when they didn't intend any slight, against us or what have you. Any comments or questions on that? Anyone else? Any other stories anyone wanted to share? Yeah, Cara.
I just wanted to confess that I usually don't approach with care and compassion people.
And why not? No, just kidding.
I did. I've always worked with really very cooperative people.
Mhm.
And, yeah.
You've
It's a
been blessed.
medical nursing profession, and we
Yeah.
needed to be cooperative, or else someone might be harmed. And
Hmm.
so I had a long, long history of that. And occasionally there'd be an angry person come through
Mhm.
during that life of caring for other people, but
Sure.
it was extremely rare.
Right.
And yeah, I guess we automatically had care and compassion for them because we figured something must be really wrong.
Sure. It was so unusual.
Typical.
Yeah.
But I was called in to show care and compassion to someone who I found really offensive, and I had developed such an aversion to the person, and we worked in such close proximity. It was just, it got to be like suffering for me. So
Mm-hmm. Mm.
I'm also a counselor, so I said, listen, you've got to just show concern
Mm-hmm.
and ask to sit down and listen
Right.
to whatever he says and let it be. And you
Right.
don't have to give the answer.
Don't have to fix it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's another thing we tend to do, and sometimes that can complicate things. But very good.
There was
Yeah.
a huge transition
Yeah. Yeah.
afterwards.
Hmm.
It was almost as though this person needed
Sure.
to know there was care and concern around him
Uh-huh.
so that he could relax more at ease.
Yeah. Good. I congratulate you. That's wonderful to step into that role and be able to do that.
Well,
Because
it
sometimes,
creates fear
yeah,
in me, and then
yeah,
I can get lots of distorted
yeah, yeah.
mind stories going
Mm-hmm.
on, and that just makes you more and more anxious,
Absolutely.
fearful, and terrible aversions.
Yeah. I mean, we can see in this category are things anger, fear, worry, stress. We can see how interrelated they are and how they can, again, even within that move from one to the other quite quickly. We get angry at a situation, but then the more we think about it, the more the fear arises, and then maybe even some worry. And then we get stressful when we're back near that person or whatever. And it can just, again, be many of these facets. In regard to stress, um, yeah, oh yes, Christine, sorry. Thank you for sharing that, Cara, by the way.
I
Yeah.
find Tong Lin really helps me to change my mind.
Yeah, yeah,
Very, very helpful, especially if
sure.
I'm in that, then my story changes.
Yeah.
It can't help but change my mind
Mm-hmm.
and energy.
Mm-hmm.
So when I have the wherewithal to go there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm blessed with that sometimes, but not always.
So for those of you who aren't familiar with the practice that Christine's mentioning, Tong Len is two Buddhist words, Tibetan Buddhist words that mean to give and take, Tong Len, but it's usually done taking and giving, and the idea is to sort of take away the suffering of that person at the time, whatever it is that's going on with them, and to give them relief and happiness. It's a very powerful way. It's kind of the opposite of what we tend to do, which is I want you to just keep all of your garbage and your suffering and your stuff, and I'll take some peace of mind and quiet. Thank you. So again, this is a powerful meditation that's done to reverse some of that, because it gets at then why we hold on to so much stuff for ourselves, why we want the peace of mind and we don't want to experience these things. It starts to target some of that and that resistance that we have. Pema Chodron is one teacher, Buddhist teacher, that's renowned for expounding upon the whole practice of Tonglen. You can certainly find some of that practice in almost any of her books. In regard to stress, I found it kind of interesting. Louis Richmond, I remember he mentioned this one. In Buddhism, we sometimes use mantras. He said that frequently a lot of stuff that we have around stress in the workplace is because of time. And he said that there was one person he encouraged to use the plenty of time mantra, plenty of time, plenty of time, plenty of time. I don't know if it actually makes more time, but it certainly keeps you from going to that place of thinking that you're under this extreme deadline, that you just, because what do we think when we're in that mode? I don't have enough time. Time's running out. We think on that side of it. I don't know. I mean, I think it's useful to certainly, try to work with that concept as best as you can. But, if our workplace affords us the opportunity to slow down at those times, then we should. I mean, I know that there's a lot of stress and pressure in many work environments, but if we can pull back a bit, breathe, the advice to just breathe is a wonderful one, to simply give us some space. And certainly any of these situations, if we're dealing with something that causes anger to arise, to find a quiet place where we can breathe and sit with ourselves, if that's possible to do. And then we have a better composure and state of mind when we go back into that scenario. But kind of on the positive side, when we're confronting some of these, we already talked a bit about anger, how it can help us to develop more compassion for others, because we can begin to see how they're suffering. That they wouldn't be doing all this stuff that angers us if they were in a different state of mind, if they were more peaceful. And we can have some thoughts of care and concern, compassion for them. But in regard to things like fear and worry, I mean, these are actually good things that contribute to our own sense of courage and our own ability to overcome problems and difficulties, right? I mean, this is a good part of, I think, how we want to be in the world. They become problematic because of our vulnerability. Because when we are dealing with fear or worry in the workplace, it's because at that time we're feeling quite vulnerable, that we could be in a situation where we have to sacrifice a lot of what we want out of the outcome, or we may even be harmed in other ways in the workplace. You never know. Our reputation, our pay, what have you, all of those things can play a role in it. But I think there's also, again, that opportunity. The flip side of it is, how do we actually use that as ways to build courage, ways to actually overcome those situations. And so, in a sense, once we kind of have that idea of using worry as a springboard for opportunity, we can actually develop a lot of wisdom if we're able once more to look at the situation and pick it apart. Most of our fears are a bit of what I was saying earlier. They're conceptual constructs. They're things that we are putting together, and we're having fear on the basis of our view of that. But how valid is our view of that, really? Can we actually go to a place of picking it apart and coming to see, is there some wisdom there, or is it really mostly all this fiction that we're creating? And try to see through our own discernment what is going on, what is it that needs to be addressed. We're certainly going to hear things and have things happen to us that will cause that to occur. The great Indian Buddhist Master Shantideva, has a wonderful bit of advice in regard to worry. He says, if it's something that can be remedied, why worry? If it's something that cannot be remedied, why worry? And the concept behind that is that if we look at the scenario and what's going on, if this fear or worry is arising, and we see that it's something that actually can be addressed, either through changing our own thinking or through actually working with it with others in the workplace, we'll then put the energy into that. Why worry? Why get all stressed out? And this is, again, a bit of that more courageous response, that we can actually do something at the time that's going to remedy the situation. Then if you look at it and you go, well, some things happen and you can't really do much to change it. The market's plummeted, and so you got to deal with the reality of that. well then why worry? I mean, why go to that place of those negative emotions that are going to make us more paralyzed, less capable of doing something when we really can't do anything about it? Instead, we should put our energies in other directions, the things that we can control, the things that we can do something about. So it's really wonderful advice. I mean, amazing how many times I end up applying that, you know. So when it comes down to the things that we hear in the workplace, sort of all the various things that occur, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, the head of our organization, actually had a wonderful quote. He says, "Don't get disturbed if you hear problems. Our ears are made to hear problems." It's kind of a different way of looking at it, that again, we acknowledge that one of the things in this quadrant that we deal with is the problems that arise in the workplace that do cause conflict when things aren't happening the way that we want them to. Shipments didn't get in on time, or the person didn't show up for the meeting, or whatever the case might be. Well, our ears are made to hear problems. Problems are a part of our natural environment. There's not a whole lot that we can do about getting rid of all problems at this stage of the game. We have to deal with problems. And we have to learn from those problems. Again, in Buddhism, this is a really rich opportunity for us to explore, changing our minds in regard to that situation. A lot of what I've already touched on. So maybe that's enough to say about this quadrant, to kind of get into a bit of how we work with that, to recognize that while this can be negative in nature, it's actually a source of great positive potential. Kind of triggering that, once more, to have the expectations were mentioned earlier, to have the expectation that you're going to go to work and everything is going to be smooth. You may have a wonderful workplace like Kara was describing where everybody's very harmonious, and it's rare that people are sort of out of sync, and you would notice it and begin to address it because of that. I would say most people have a workplace where it's quite normal to have problems and difficulties every day. So we have to learn how to surf that, how to ride the waves of conflict, of problems, and make sure that we don't kind of get sucked into it in the ways that we habitually do, but rather find these new approaches that can be, again, sources of great wisdom, courage, compassion for us. So any other final comments on that one before we go on? Let's go to the next one that we're going to work with, which we're going to go in a counterclockwise direction. We're going to go down to the other negative, which is stagnation. The qualities that are here, or the experiences that are here, are boredom, even discouragement, failure, depression. Has anyone ever dealt with those in the workplace before? No. Stagnation, again, when we talk about stagnation, of course, this is one of the harder ones to work with in some ways because it is a real inability to grow. It's kind of feeling like things are not in that, we're not out in the light, we're more in the dark, we're more in the places that cause us to get sucked deeper down rather than pulled out in a more violent way, which is what conflict is all about. So these are both negative, but it's that down energy, that cool energy that we're working with. And they can become a bit problematic, particularly if we've done a job for a very long time and we're dealing with, repeating tasks and activities that we get somewhat tired of, that we're continuing to do again and again and again. Might even get quite lethargic. It can lead to a lot of fatigue, a lot of joyless work. And so this can be a real problem for many people. Certainly, again, our workplace does afford places where this does happen. But again, we can emerge from this. There is that other side to it that we're going to explore in regard to some of these experiences under stagnation, where we can actually emerge with greater enthusiasm and inspiration, almost take it diametrically, to the other side. So let's take a look at some of these. Boredom. Obviously, we avoid being present when we get bored. We just kind of, start doing things by rote. We don't pay so much attention. We don't have so much mindful awareness. It was interesting, an article that appeared through Greater Good, which is out of UC Berkeley, a wonderful organization that kind of works around compassion and other things in all different environments, said that there was an article there that was on how to focus a wandering mind. And what they said there is there was a study by two gentlemen, Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert, who sampled over 2,000 adults during their day-to-day activities. And they found that 47% of the time their minds were not focused on what they were currently doing. Now, if you were a workplace manager and you knew that 47% of the time that your employees were working for you, they weren't really fully engaged in what they were doing. They weren't focused on what they were doing. They were sort of tuning out. I think you'd be concerned, right? That's half of their time. But, for ourselves, if that's half of our time that we spend in work, that we're just kind of mindlessly going about our work, well, again, obviously that is going to be pretty boring. It's going to lead to that sort of potentially even some of these others, discouragement or depression, because we're not really present with what we're doing. There's none of that energy that we need. Again, once again, this is in the cool sector because we need to find ways to stimulate ourselves out of that, to actually bring ourselves to being more present, to having even again a different attitude. And it may mean that the work itself doesn't change because we do have that as our assigned task that we have to do. It's how we work with our minds when we're doing that. To bring a fresher outlook to our being there, to bring a new attitude to it, and perhaps some humor. We might be able to bring some creativity to it. Might be able to find different ways to do what we're doing, or to engage in it. And even certainly, again, some of the qualities we've been talking about developing that are part of our spiritual path: some compassion, some care, some concern for others. I can't imagine what it's like. I actually did a little bit of kind of factory work when I was younger, and even turning hamburgers at a White Castle in St. Louis for a whole summer. But the repetitive stuff. I mean, if we can think about the people who are on the receiving end of what we're doing, that might be one way of giving us another angle of why we're doing what we're doing. And it's no task for any company isn't just about us, and our doing that. It's always producing something for other people. It's always some other dimension involving other people. So again, if we can bring some attitude that's about having an awareness of that, trying to make what we're doing perhaps a bit more meaningful, a bit more purposeful, and try to pull ourselves out of a bit of that boredom or depression that we experience. The one that's on here as well of discouragement, I think this again can be very problematic. Certainly this is a cause for a lot of discontent in our world, is people feeling discouraged by the work that they do, by the tasks that they have. We could certainly go deeper, beyond our ordinary resources for coping, by tapping into what is our even ordinary intention for being there, but also our spiritual intention for being there. And if we have another dimension to our lives, going back to that idea I introduced earlier about being kind of living congruently, having everything being an extension of our spiritual path, well then, as tedious or boring or difficult that things might get, we can always bring that dimension of seeing it as, how do we actually engage the mind at that time to increase our positive qualities, to diminish our negative tendencies. It might be more challenging with some of these in the cool sector because, again, the energy isn't there. So we have to bring some of that from our own side, our own energy and enthusiasm from our spiritual practice. So this is where one of the remedies might be to actually spend our time that we do outside of work engaging in things that we can then bring into the workplace, things that make us feel inspired. There's some of the topics.
Making mandolins.
Making mandolins. Maybe as a,
Seriously,
yeah.
I mean, and there is a point to that. If you're a craftsperson,
Sure.
and you know that innate understanding of single pointed focus,
Mhm.
I mean, of making a pot,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's not high energy. This is
Sure.
a lower. I mean, this is in the cooler area actually.
Right.
You're just having that single pointed focus,
Mm-hmm.
and
And yet you're quite calm. I mean, it's moreover again in the positive realm. But I think we can bring that type of energy, into the workplace, kind of make it into something more positive by bringing a different state of mind, again, different attitude. It gets more challenging, as I said. Maybe I'll share one more passage from Work as a Spiritual Practice by Louis Richmond. Excuse me. This whole idea of kind of spiritual intention and ordinary intention that I mentioned, he says here, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, or so the saying goes. We make a New Year's resolution to lose weight, we work hard at it for a few weeks, and then our effort lapses and we are reduced to joking about it with our friends. Or we tell ourselves this is the year we're going to learn Spanish, we buy some instruction tapes, and after a few weeks the tapes just gather dust in our car's glove compartment. These are examples of ordinary intention, whose success or failure is measured by whether or not we meet our goal or not. But there is another kind of intention where attaining a goal is secondary and discouragement, therefore, is less likely because it's more about the process, more about what is going on in the moment, rather than what is it that we're trying to achieve. And if we're dealing with more monotonous types of tasks and things, that sense of accomplishment is not necessarily going to be there, but rather the ability to have it unfold in a continuous kind of way. He says here, spiritual intention is concerned not with short-term success, but with the long-term direction of our life. Whether we attain our goal is not as important as our firm commitment to stay pointed in the right direction, to continue to do the work that progresses more gradually, a bit more of, again, what you're talking about, Carolyn, in terms of a much more deliberate mind that is there with the task and doing what it can to keep that more positive spiritual intention behind it. It will be unlikely to move it completely all the way over into something that's that hot in terms of energy, but if we can at least get it to move into something that's more positive and away from the negative, I think it'll be much, much more useful. The one other thing on here, failure, I did touch on that a little bit, but I wanted, this once more does get a bit into that tendency we have of dictating what is good or bad. And that also is a story that we tell ourselves. There's the tale of the Taoist farmer. You know, Taoism teaches a sort of balance between all of these things. And the story is the Taoist farmer has a horse, and one day the horse runs away, and the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, how sad, your horse ran away." And then the Taoist farmer tells the neighbor, "Well, who knows what's good or bad?" And then the next day, the horse returns with a wild horse that it's companioned with, and he now has two horses. And so the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, how wonderful, you have two horses now." And he says, "Oh, who knows what's good or bad?" The next day, the farmer's son is out trying to break the wild horse and falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, I'm so sad to hear about your son, he broke his leg." "Who knows what's good or bad?" says the Taoist farmer. The final one, well, this doesn't go on forever, I won't be here all evening. The final one is that the army comes through the next day, taking young men and women to go off and fight in the military. And of course his son has a broken leg, so he can't go. And so once more the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, how wonderful, your son, got to stay back and didn't have to go off to war." And he says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" So we don't know. We make these value judgments. What's a failure? Failures are opportunities to learn. Where would we be in our lives if we never made mistakes? Seriously, any one of us. We're here because of the mistakes that we've made, the failures we've had, in quotes, that actually were rich learning opportunities because we learned something that we then applied in a similar situation or another situation that we were then able to be more successful at. But it's all grist for the mill. Even successes can sometimes have their points where they can be negative. We all like the success. We all like that feeling of accomplishment. But as we're going to see, those can even be dangerous to some degree as well. But this whole quadrant, of stagnation, all the various things that can come about it, again, this can be dangerous if we just spiral downward and continue those sorts of thoughts, feeling like we're a failure, become depressed, get really discouraged in what we're doing. All of this can be quite hard to work our way out of. So we have to keep it from going down there by trying to move the mind in different directions, regardless of what's going on in the workplace. Any stories that anyone wanted to share in regard to that themselves with their own work experience, or even in other environments? Again, can have relationships that become stagnant, correct? Has anyone been in one of those, or even periods of those?
I'll share.
Yeah, Kristen.
The thing I used to like the least about my job
Mm-hmm.
is now one of the things that brings me the greatest joy. It's interesting.
Uh-huh.
And I finally just accepted it and then began to see the depth of that aspect of my job. And now
Wonderful.
open up to a whole new world.
Yeah.
And now it's really a great source of joy for me. I find
Great.
that really fascinating. And I used to just loathe it. It was every day like, oh, if I only just didn't have to do this, that
Right.
would be so great.
Yeah, I would love working here, except, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting and it was very repetitive.
Right.
It was very boring. Same
Mhm.
thing every day, every day, every day. It's like, ugh. And now if I don't do it, there's something missing in me if I miss it for a few days.
Right.
Like I don't feel right.
Interesting.
Yeah,
That's
it's very
great.
fascinating.
And it's really just, again, a shift of your mind
Right.
and how you were looking at it and how you chose to approach it
That's
and see it.
right.
I think there's great lesson in there. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Anyone else want to share anything on that? Okay.
I
Yeah.
was just thinking of something.
Oh.
You know how we set our motivation before a meditation, and,
Uh-huh.
and then we dedicate our work at the end.
Right.
And and I think that could be done in schools, in
Sure.
workplaces, more often.
Mhm.
At one point, I was a carpenter,
Mm.
and my dedication at the end was like cleaning the shop, like cleaning it all out, this huge mess that
Right.
I had created, and then just making it meticulous at the end,
Uh-huh.
and
Great.
anyway. So I
Uh-huh.
think how you begin and how you end something
Is very
there's
relevant, yeah.
cycles within
Yeah.
cycles.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if I have time at the end, I'm going to share a little bit more of what Lama Zopa says about a work day and attitude for work. And it is a good part of that, of having a really strong intention at the beginning of the day, a motivation that is quite positive. Um, Again, in this tradition, we have that motivation that our lives are dedicated to the welfare of all beings and to serving others as best as we can, and to have that as kind of the way we live our lives. And at the end of our time at work or in our day, to make sure that we do a bit of cleaning up, looking at the things that weren't so skillful that we can maybe improve on, and doing it very kindly and gently. And then also looking at the things that we did well and rejoicing in those, being happy that we had an ability to transform, menial tasks that we used to hate into something quite joyful, or whatever the case might be. So I think those are actually really useful for anybody. Unfortunately, a lot of people might have motivations that become a bit more ordinary in regard to their work, that they're there to get that paycheck, to do the things that they love with that paycheck, and that becomes the extent of it. But if they brought that different motivation for being there, it wouldn't be just about that. It might actually become something that's, again, much more about the whole person rather than just about filling the bank account or something. So, should we move on to another quadrant? Explore another one of these dimensions of what goes on. Let's actually go diagonally up over to inspiration. Start with the hot positive and then end with the cool positive. So I think we all, have some desire to be in this quite frequently, and those are sometimes the most exciting times of our life, right? Where we feel like there's new doors opening, where we feel quite inspired about what we're doing, where we feel that there's all this room for creativity, for our ambition starts to grow. These other ones, forgiveness is kind of an interesting one. Doesn't seem like it quite belongs on the list, but I'll get to that in a moment. I understand why Lewis Richmond put it there, but joy, certainly. This is where we think that if someone has a good job, we think they're in this quadrant all the time, right? They're feeling really inspired. They can't wait to go to work, and they feel like they get to apply all of their creative juices, and everything's just like wonderful. But there's some pitfalls to this quadrant as well. We have energy to spare, but we can find it sometimes to be unstable, because the reality is to maintain that type of thing all the time does take a lot of energy ourselves as well. It gives us energy, certainly, but remember, this is a wheel, and things do change. And if we get stuck in wanting to be in that quadrant and things don't end up in that quadrant, we come to work and suddenly there's conflict, we may find that suddenly all of these things disappear because we don't have what we're looking for. Again, our expectations are that that's what we need, that's what we want, that's what we thrive in. So there's lots of wonderful things about this quadrant, many things that it can bring to us, but there's change once more. And it's not going to be able to stay in that quadrant all the time. I mean, I feel very fortunate in doing what I'm doing, sitting here and going blah, 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 and hopefully producing something that will be of benefit to others. But I have to say, it's not always in that quadrant. I enjoy what I do very much. I feel very inspired by what I do. But there's times when it does feel like, moves into something else, becomes something that's a little bit more challenging to work with. So if I get this expectation that this is where I'm always going to be and it's always going to be that way for me, then I can't once more ride the waves of what's changing, of what's happening, and figure out a way to actually use whatever I'm being confronted with in more positive ways. One of the things that happens around ambition, for example, that can be a little bit dangerous is that we do tend to have sometimes that mind of wanting more. Ambition is a wonderful thing to have, but to what extent are we being driven by some expectation that, again, we're always going to be getting more, that we're always going to have new, fresh opportunities? And then we fall into the stagnation and the boredom when we don't necessarily get that. You know, I would think even being here at a center like Denise's and working, there'd be things that you get excited about and feel very inspired. And then frequently there's just a lot of things that just have to be done week in and week out. So again, if we have too much ambition and always want this, things to become more, we might feel even dissatisfied at times if we aren't always getting that. That can be one of the problematic areas. Um, Creativity itself, again, is wonderful to have, but I would say probably a lot of occupations don't give that much opportunity for creativity. Frequently, we're doing things within a defined set of guidelines and boundaries. And so we can be creative to a degree, but maybe we can't be as creative as what we would like. So once more, where can we find different avenues of that expression of our own kind of personality, our own way of being creative? Um, Even find again ways of it being spiritually rewarding and spiritually creative, as opposed to not necessarily always being creative on the outside. How do we take something and make it into an interesting exploration? So when we have our staff meetings every week or something like that, and we're going into it with not the expectation that it's going to be a place of boredom and stagnation, but rather a place where we might be able to really do a deeper investigation of our own role, everyone else in the room, where they're coming from. Not to, again, be critical of them, but rather to really get to know them at a deeper level, to create more harmony, more connection to others. Why forgiveness is here is kind of interesting. He says the act of apologizing and forgiving, is very high energy. So it's there because of the high energy side of it. But obviously, it is a little bit more difficult. It's not quite as much fun, if you will, necessarily as creativity or ambition. But it does create inspiration when forgiveness is the sort of default mode in the workplace. If we have a workplace where that isn't kind of there, people aren't apologizing for what they do, they aren't being forgiven for what they do, and there's always that underlying tension, it's hard for people to feel inspired because they feel like there's, again, an undermining of that type of energy that needs to be there for things to move forward. Resolution to issues is an important part of it. Apologizing and forgiving are kind of the two complementary sides, right? From our side, we want to be willing to do both. To apologize, as the Buddhist teacher Sylvia Bornstein, she says there's 9 words that could change the world. And she actually got these from Rabbi David Zeller. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Please forgive me. Okay? I mean, how many times have we been willing to do that, courageous enough to do that, to apologize to others for the mistakes that we've made, and to, again, try to create that healing? An amazing thing happens with forgiving and apologizing that isn't going to be there, again, if that act isn't seen through. Again, we're not always going to do that as skillfully or even with the timing that we would like. Sometimes we might ask for an apology from somebody who's still quite in that hot zone, and they might not be ready to extend that apology, to forgive us, or to complement it with forgiving. So we have to be careful in how we do this. But forgiveness is actually very inspirational in the workplace. I'm sure that you've all had the experience one time or another of even a boss forgiving or asking for forgiveness, apologizing for something that they did that harmed the department or harmed, the work environment. I mean, that's really quite powerful because it's quite humbling, right? You have a sense of humility there. Kind of allows us to kind of all be on the same level. When we're forgiving, we're never doing it from a place of superiority. We're doing it from a place of at least equals, if not wanting to see oneself beneath others and have that sense of humility. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, again, our spiritual director on humility, says humility actually comes naturally if you are kind and forgive others. So we see it as related to it. And if we practice forgiving, we actually increase our humility. And humility is another one of those vulnerable places that we can be in the workplace. But it's actually a very healing one. And it's a good place to, again, have that connection that does allow the workplace to be more inspiring. See if I want to say anything more. Joy, I mean, obviously, bringing joy into the workplace is a wonderful thing and does create a much more inspiring environment. If you're in a place that's very solemn all the time and it's very hard to be joking and laughing at work or what have you, I can't imagine what that would be like. I mean, one Buddhist teacher I had said in regard to the Buddhist practice that if your study and practice of Buddhism isn't fun, then you're not doing it right. And at some level, I feel like this is a bit of the challenge in the workplace is how do we bring that joy, even if the environment isn't like that? Can we be joyful ourselves, feel inspired ourselves? We might have to, again, find sources of that outside of work that we bring in that are from our spiritual practice. Really taking joy in the opportunity that we have in this life to work with our minds, to be able to develop our hearts, but also taking joy in others. This whole quadrant, it's going to start to move down into accomplishment, where we also see the necessity of being much more inclusive of others. But if we're sort of just going and aiming for ourselves to be inspired, it's not going to be the full effect that we'd like. We want to bring everyone into this joyful atmosphere and environment and not feel such a strong sense of competition with others. It's a wonderful quote from Theodore Roosevelt, actually, that's comparison is the thief of joy. We're comparing ourselves to others and making it into an us and them thing, trying to find, well, are they doing better than I am? Are they getting paid more than I am? Whatever the case might be. Well, then we end up with that type of dampening our joy, because it just, whatever there is to be joyful about has all of a sudden been brought down, a few degrees by our comparing ourselves, comparing others to ourselves, and so on. So I think we can find lots of tools to work with here in regard to how we bring that inspirational energy and don't let it kind of go too far again to where we become disappointed when it's not maintained at that level. Does anyone want to share any stories or experiences that you've had around that quadrant? How many of you feel like you've done something that was greatly inspirational, joyful, and can it speak to that? Or, you don't have to tell me about it, but raise of hands of how many people have really done that with their lives? Good number. That's great. I mean, I think when I first started in the corporate world, it wasn't so common. A lot of people were doing, and I myself was doing that. My work wasn't bringing me great amounts of joy. I loved the people I worked with and was content doing it. But it was a bit more of that, taking the paycheck home so I could have a joyful life, so I could do what I wanted to do. So it was a real disconnect. But when we have that, when we feel like our deep sense of purpose and who we are and how we want to be in the world is flowing into the workplace, feeding into that inspiration, that creativity. And what I did wasn't necessarily creative. I mean, I was very non-creative, but probably was a bit of it. But yeah, better about dreaming.
Between joy and excitement, and sometimes excitement can
Sure.
get like scattered and
Yeah.
unproductive.
Yeah. I mean, I think again that is one of the problems with joyful attitudes is if they go into that realm of excitement or even like frivolity, where the workplace almost doesn't have, it loses its sense of purpose because it's more about having fun there than it is about kind of fulfilling the mission of your work. Then I think we do have to again rein that in a bit. In Buddhist terms, excitement is that mind that does get a bit more drawn to wandering to all of the pleasurable things that entice us. And so Yeah, I mean, you may have a department or a group of people that are all very happy to be there, but if they're not producing at some level and it becomes more frivolous, I would say that that's where it's kind of again gone askew. That's one of the problems with again a hot positive is that it becomes so positive that you can almost get carried away with some of that energy. I don't know if you do have your own view on that question and what from your own experience.
I think that the two can get confused
Yeah, yeah,
because in our culture, I think excitement is confused with happiness.
sure,
Like in
sure.
advertising, they're usually showing people getting excited about something that's superficial.
Yeah, getting excited about things frequently that most people don't get that excited about, but maybe they do by seeing other people get excited about them. But yeah, no, I think that there is that tendency sometimes for excitement to get a bit misdirected or misguided. You know, it's not really aimed at a particular thing. When we bring joy into the workplace, it's with the idea that we are about fulfilling that task that we as a department or we as a group, what have you, have before us. And so it becomes something that gets channeled into it in a very wonderful way because then there's joy in what we're doing and we're doing it. If it becomes excitement and a bit more frivolous, then we have joy in what we're doing, but nothing's getting done. We're not moving it in that right direction.
Maybe we need a warm positive.
Yeah, there's probably going to be things that are between some of these. You know, I mean,
Right.
we
In fact, I would put forgiveness, my
maybe,
experience, in more the cooler.
yeah.
I think it can be.
Well, I think why he put it there is because there can be a lot of energy around that type of thing. I
Yeah,
mean,
but I think that's dangerous. Like kind of
I see. Yeah,
what
yeah.
Dreamy was alluding to.
Mm,
If you're gonna forgive, you'd better be subdued. I mean, have it together, and have for it to be
yeah,
truly deep
yeah.
forgiveness. It's got
Okay.
to be come from
Yeah,
a
I see
warmer
what you're
or
saying.
cooler place.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think that there could be some debate definitely on where forgiveness belongs on here. I think Lewis Richmond's thing was that it does produce more inspiration when it is a regular part of our work ethic that we're going to apologize and we're going to forgive others that do things negative. There was another hand up here. Yeah, Steve.
I did. I'll go for musical illusion this time.
Uh huh.
When John Lennon talked about across the universe, and he said it's exciting and inviting. Well, it seems like that quadrant is the most exciting and inviting. But of course, we always know what the darker side of that is.
Yeah,
It's the most dangerous quadrant, it seems to me.
I think it can be. It can be. Why do you say that, Steve? I'm curious.
Well, Van Gogh cut his ear off, and he had all those qualities.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
can it can lead us to such elation and
Mm-hmm.
such a high that,
Right.
of course, the yarn of that is it can be pretty troubling.
Yeah. I mean, this is what's kind of interesting is that while we tend to look at them as like halves or top, bottom, what have you, the diagonal is frequently the route that one takes from the highs of the inspiration and creativity to the lows of the stagnation and the discouragement, So you can see that there's dangers in any of these. But you may be right. That may be one of the dangerous places to be because when you're, what do they say? Something about the higher up the bigger the fall is, the greater the fall. The higher they are, the greater the fall, or something. I can't remember the exact quote. So the higher we are in terms of that mood that we get so used to, and then we come into the workplace and suddenly something's changed. We have a new boss, and that new boss is going to create that sort of stress and worry because we don't know what's going on, and we might even go home quite depressed because we don't have the same expectation isn't being met. Yeah, we have this setup, if you will, with inspiration that's a little bit difficult. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting to me is I think at work, yeah, you do move around a lot between those quadrants,
Uh
right?
huh.
I mean, you might feel real happy at times, and then it goes over to some of the other stuff, stress and everything.
Right.
And for me, what I'm thinking about is managing a lot of employees, like how they must feel, because I'm more always
Uh huh.
content or inspired, but I know they're not always that. And so they're trying to think of
Yeah.
like, what can you do to make them not feel, bored or sad? Because
Sure.
sometimes the work is super exciting, but sometimes it's not. It's just, it is the same stuff over and
Sure.
over.
Sure. Have you found any answers to that in your experience? What's your name, by the way?
Charanjeet.
Taranjeet. Yes. Any answers to that, Taranjeet?
Just trying to do regular, like, company things that
Uh
try
huh.
to inspire them,
Right.
or try to reward them when they've done great work, or
Uh-huh.
we try to do
Uh-huh.
some company outings and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, good.
So trying to make it seem like, okay, what they're doing is more than just inputting data.
Right.
Uh,
Right. Right. And that is actually moving into this last quadrant that we have. It's like, again, at those periods where we can feel a sense of accomplishment, to make sure that we do what we can through being generous, uh, helping people to have that feeling of accomplishment and success in what they've done, so that they can continue doing the work that will potentially move over into that quadrant, but that you can keep them doing the work by doing those sorts of things. And again, this is a much more positive place to be when we're able to acknowledge it. Thanks, Taranji, for sharing that. Yeah. So let's talk about this last quadrant of accomplishment. Obviously, this is also one that is sort of nice to be in. It is a positive, but obviously this is much cooler in terms of it's not the driving to get there, the inspiration we feel all the time. It's the low tide after things have been done, when we've done a good job, when things have been accomplished in the workplace. So this is more about sharing, giving, and including rather than the winning, acquiring, striving, all of that inspiration is about. Um, Accomplishment usually entails some sort of financial or material success, but also again spiritual success we would include in this, measured by the extent to which we have developed our character on the basis of our endeavors in the workplace. So accomplishment here, when we put a spiritual spin on it, is more about the inner sense of accomplishment we can have around how we did in following these principles throughout our day. So we might be able to, even though we're doing something, again, because we were comparing it also to the green sector there, the stagnation, we may be doing something that's quite repetitive, but because we're working with our minds and changing our attitudes, we're actually able to make it into a sense of accomplishment, that we're not wasting that time, that it isn't this complete divide between how we want to be in our spiritual life and how we want to be in our work life, that they actually do become complementary. So accomplishment is an interesting one. There's with contentment and calm, there's always dangers of complacency and self-absorption. This is a place where that can happen because we're sort of resting on our laurels potentially at that juncture. When we have accomplished something, we have to be ready for the next thing that inspires, the next thing that causes us to strive and drive for new results and what have you. Um, so there's going to be periods of this, though, obviously, in any workplace. And the calm and relaxation can actually be a very conducive environment for creating a lot of other qualities in the workplace. Harmony, that feeling of the team and people accomplishing things together, trying to bring people together in another way. That is important when they take off again on another task, when things move in another direction. So I think it's important to see this as can be a very calming place, but one that can be utilized to mm, in, increase some of that, the qualities that we'll need when we encounter something again, harmony, gratitude, appreciation, those sorts of things. I think that this is also a time when potentially we can find room to connect with others by being more careful in our speech and how we communicate with each other. Sometimes when we get into some of these other zones, the hot zones, it's everything has that high energy, so we're frequently not thinking about what we're saying or how we're saying what we're saying. And of course, in Buddhism, our speech is one of the main tools that is an expression of our minds. And one of the main ways that we connect with others, certainly in the workplace, we might be there physically with others, but it's usually our speech is how we are connecting with others. So it's actually, this can be a quadrant in which we can do something with that positive energy to increase that communication, that rapport that people have with others. That can then be relied upon when the heat goes back up, when you move into the top part, hopefully in the positive one, but no doubt anytime you're moving in that direction in most workplaces, you're going to have conflict arising potentially too, because things, once more, don't always go as we plan. I don't know that I need to say a whole lot more about that quadrant. It is one place of, again, openness, willingness. A lot of positive things can come out of it because of the sense of accomplishment when it is inclusive. But at the same time, we can still have this individually. in terms of our own approach to what we do, how we contribute to the workplace. Any other reflections on that zone? Okay, so these do, again, this is a wheel, so we're going to move back and forth between these throughout our day. Um, as was mentioned by Carolyn, and I wanted to kind of close with a few of these comments around the spiritual practice that we have here, that's sort of the container for this in Tibetan Buddhism. As we mentioned earlier, there's this strong focus on having a really positive intention to begin with. Now, the FPMT, our organization, the founder, Lama Yeshe, as well as Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who's our current spiritual director, really emphasize this idea of us being of service to others, as I mentioned earlier. You know, if we start our day that we are there in whatever position, you might be a CEO, you might be a supervisor, or someone who has people that are beneath you, but your job really is still to serve all of them, to serve all beings if possible. That's a very far-reaching motivation, but at least those beings that you work with, you know, to have some effect on them in a positive way, to increase their happiness, to help them to not find things so difficult and challenging and what have you, to help them grow, to help them have their own spiritual path. So, I mean, if this is kind of the strong intention we set at the very beginning of the day, it can, if we're mindful of it, you know, influence things throughout the day. This brings me to discussing the whole factor of mindfulness, which, again, in Buddhist terms, there's different presentations of what we mean by mindfulness. Some of what has been kind of thrown around as mindfulness, which is perfectly fine, it is one way of looking at mindfulness, is this idea of just sort of an unconditional acceptance or presence with whatever is going on. And that is a useful tool to have because we're not then caught up maybe in so much judgment and comparison and all the other things that would be detrimental at those times. But there's another level of mindfulness which means really not being forgetful of what it is that we're trying to do. And we talk about using work as a spiritual practice. Well, that means we have to be mindful throughout our day to do that. So it's mindful of something. It's not just sort of being mindfully present with anything that goes on. It's being mindful of how we want to be in the world. So when we set that positive intention at the beginning of the day and we say, I'm here to be a servant to others, to help others in whatever ways I can, to help them not have so much suffering, to help them be happy, then we have to be mindful of that throughout our day. So when we get in our car, we're thinking of that. And how can we be of benefit to others? Even if we don't have situations where we're letting another car go in front of us or what have you, those are nice things to do, you know, but you have to be aware of the people behind you too that are waiting for you to take your turn so that they don't get all upset. But anyway, the idea is that we can still even have those thoughts while we're driving. We can have those thoughts while we're doing anything. And then when we're in the workplace, that'll kind of be top of mind. We'll be thinking, oh, okay, I'm going to still do my job. I'm still going to fulfill my job description and all the various tasks that I have to do. But I'm going to try to do it with that intention. Make it as big as you can. You know, if we can in this tradition, we think all beings benefiting from what we're doing. But at least to think of others to some degree. Kind of takes us out of, as I was saying, so much of that sort of self-centered focus that we tend to have. It tends to think about what we need and isn't quite so concerned about what others need. If we bring that into the workplace all the time, again and again, it absolutely will have an effect. If we can get others to mirror that and model that, how wonderful. We'd work in a wonderful place where everybody is mutually concerned about everyone else. So actually there's a little, I told this story over the weekend, but maybe I'll tell it again. That's all about kind of the idea that we actually achieve our greatest potential by taking care of others. And this whole story has been made into a video that is an animated video that I saw that I don't like as well as the story, but anyway, that's another story. There's this spiritual student of a master, and he asked the master one day, what is heaven and what is hell? And the master says, come here, I'll show you. And he creates this imaginary landscape of a building, and they're walking down a corridor. And then he has a door on the right-hand side, and he opens the door, and the door opens, and the student sees this huge table in the room, very large round table. And in the center of the table is a bowl of really delicious smelling soup. It's just, the steam rising, and it's just very fragrant. Seated around the table are all of these individuals looking very frustrated and sad and hungry. And they all have these really, really long spoons, kind of 4 feet. And they're kind of reaching into the soup. But the problem is when they bring the soup back, they can't get it to their mouths because the handle is so long on the spoon. And so the master tells the servant, "This is hell." And then they go to the next room and open up the door, and it looks like the exact same thing. There's the bowl of soup in the center of the round table. Everyone's got the same long spoons, but everyone's happy, getting along really well and looking very fulfilled, not hungry, not tired, nothing. They're all really enjoying it. And the student says to the master, I don't understand, what this is. And he says, the master says, well, this is heaven. And the only difference between heaven and hell is that the beings here, the people here, have learned to feed each other. So the real difference is everyone's needs, in a sense, can be met when everyone is focused on everyone else. And it does make sense at some level, but our world is one where we think we have to be like the first room. Get our spoon into the soup and get it to our mouths. And frequently we don't. Frequently we find that very hard. But if we were feeding others, if we were taking care of others in that way, we would be one of the people receiving a spoon from another person. I mean, it might sound a little socialist or something, but maybe the story comes from Bernie Sanders. But
No, it was before him.
it predates Bernie. But in essence, I mean, we're not talking about just soup or feeding or money or something like that. We're talking about just our general way of going about our lives. Are we as concerned and caring for others as we tend to be right now for ourselves? And what would it be like if we lived our lives that way? And I think this can be very instrumental in the workplace. And unfortunately, we still do have in working America a lot of competition, a lot of sense of people watching out for themselves, watching out for number one. But the reality is we are interdependent. And in any workplace, you know this, right? Because you are dependent upon the other people to do their jobs in order to do your job. There's no person in a workforce that stands completely alone, that isn't dependent upon other people. I know when I worked for Levi Strauss, you had the whole, manufacturing sector, right? That depended upon, first of all, people designing properly all of the clothing that was going to be made, and then all of the people who ordered all of the fabric that needed to be cut and all the sundries that needed to be attached to the garments and everything that was involved. It was a huge web of interdependence to make a pair of jeans. So just to make a pair of jeans is involved. Any workplace is going to be certainly involved with other people, and if we have that mutual regard and concern for others, we're going to be much happier at what we do, and we're going to find the work much more fulfilling. We might feel a bit more joy, a bit more inspired. So I would encourage you to explore that idea, to see if perhaps that's something that could be useful. Back on the topic of mindfulness, because as I was saying, this is the whole point, is we have to be mindful of that's why we're there. That's why I'm in a relationship with this person. That's why I'm going out with my friends. That's why I'm at work. That's why I'm at whatever. Any part of our life isn't compartmentalized, but rather we have a mindful awareness that it all fits into the same picture, which is us trying to be our best in regard to our own spiritual path. So it does entail, to some degree, a dependence upon meditation. Most of you have some level of a meditation practice. But this is where we sit on the cushion and try to develop some of that mindful awareness that can be really useful when we get up off the cushion to be able to maintain some of that. I'm going to share one quote from another book that's by, I can't remember the gentleman who wrote it. It's a book called The Wisdom of Listening, and it's actually a collection of pieces from different teachers, and not just Buddhist traditions, I think, but other traditions. It says, this is also how you can begin breaking down the artificial division between your spiritual practice and daily work. Allow the inspiration and spacious generosity of your meditation to transform your perception of those you meet. Allow it to inform your choices and responses so that your life becomes a continuous and active expression of your deepest motivation. just kind of right in line again with what Steve Pavlina was saying at the beginning, that if we actually develop the tools and the skills and abilities as we go through the energy wheel throughout our day, we're going to have a consistent thread, which is how we want to be in the world, how we want it to be an expression of our deepest motivation, of our spiritual intention, and everything kind of flowing forth from that. I don't know if I have a whole lot more to say. We're getting close to the end, but yeah, let's see what questions, Peter.
A quote from a book that
Absolutely.
His Holiness wrote.
Uh-huh.
It's called Meditation,
Uh-huh.
Discovering Innermost Awareness.
Sure, please do, Peter.
If people carry out their work with good motivation, that work becomes an instrument for human benefit. On the other hand, if people utilize their profession not with this motive, but out of selfishness or with anger, profession becomes distorted. Instead of bringing benefit to humankind, the knowledge gained in the profession brings more disaster. So compassion is essential.
Yeah, yeah, good. Thank you for sharing that, and thank His Holiness for those kind words. I mean, yeah, compassion is really one of the key things involved in this motivation of being a benefit to others, to really see them through that lens. So that's wonderful. Thank you. Anything anyone else wanted to share before we conclude tonight? Okay. Let's conclude with just a few thoughts. Again, this was mentioned earlier with regard to Carolyn's comment. We talked about kind of beginning our day and the importance of that with having a positive motivation. And we also kind of have a conclusion, and we even do this with our sessions here. We just take a moment at the end of the time that we spent together to think back over this last, hour and 40 minutes or so that we spent investigating this topic. And I might even encourage you to think of just one thing that you heard tonight that you think might be useful. I mean, I hope that a lot of what I said was useful, but even just to take one thing and say, I could try that. And just make that very clear in your own mind and have some intention around wanting to explore that idea. And to be very gentle with yourself in exploring that, but to make a commitment to say that you will get up tomorrow, go to work or whatever it is that you do, explore things through the day using that one piece of advice that we looked at tonight, that one that you want to be dedicated to exploring. And just make that commitment in your heart right now that you will do that. And think that whatever that accomplishes by applying that to your life, or whatever else you're able to utilize from tonight, whatever positive seeds might have been planted by being here, may this bring forth the greatest happiness and benefit for both ourselves as well as for all beings. Okay, thank you all for being here. Again, I hope it was of use and that you're able to apply some of this in your life.